Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this LinkedIn Live event on how to avoid greenwashing in your brand's communications. My name's Nikki Stones. I'm VP of Marketing at CleanHub, where we're working to solve the world's plastic waste problem. I'm delighted to be joined today by Ed Fletcher, Co-Managing Director of social impact communications agency Shape History, and Karen Sutton, founder of the Global Good Awards. A very warm welcome to both of you. Perhaps you'd like to tell our guests a little bit more about yourselves and why you're so passionate about this topic. Karen, over to you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Karen Sutton. I'm the founder of Global Good Awards. We're a social and environmental sustainability awards programme that truly practices what it preaches. Just as a few examples, we've had a vegan menu since 2018. We don't allow international finalists to our ceremony. We always choose sustainable venues, and we have a very transparent and fair judging process. Prior to Global Good Awards, I had a career in design communications. So the combination of these two together is kind of why I'm here today.
Thanks, Karen. And Ed?
Yeah, hi there. I'm Ed Fletcher. I'm one of the co-managing directors at Shape History. So as Nikki mentioned, we're a social impact communications agency working to make the world a fairer place faster. So we work with pioneering institutions, brands, philanthropic organizations all over the world, and look at how we can help them use creative storytelling, strategic communications, and importantly, authenticity across all their communications and marketing to accelerate the social outcomes that they're looking to achieve, that we're all looking to achieve, whether that be across climate, health, human rights, and everything in between. So working towards the full 2030 agenda. I guess I'm really excited and passionate about, well, not passionate about greenwashing, but passionate about certainly having this conversation, because I think there is a lot of misinformation, miscommunication that's gone out over the last, particularly like 5 years, but I think it's been going on a lot longer than that. And that's not probably just, that extends further than just greenwashing. There's sports washing and all sorts. So that I think has led to a real trepidation, particularly with kind of relatively new or kind of emerging businesses, about how to communicate impact, particularly environmental impact, but actually kind of all levels of impact. And yeah, hopefully we can do a bit of debugging and myth busting today to help give a bit more direction for people.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both. I think we've definitely got the right people in the room for a lively discussion. And also just want to say a very big welcome to everyone that's joining us either live or via recording later. For those of you that are live, we will have time for questions at the end. So please do ask them in the chat as we go through, and we will get through as many as we can. So as a reminder, we're here today to talk about the hot topic of greenwashing and most importantly, how to avoid it. I think one thing that is definitely worth acknowledging before we dig in too deeply is the fact that actually sustainability has actually become mainstream, right? More and more organizations now are trying to do the right thing for people and planet. They realize they have to in order to stay relevant. And ultimately, that's a really positive thing for all of us. But obviously, it does mean the stakes are higher and companies may be more likely to go out and make misleading claims or give the impression they're more sustainable than they actually are. And so, Ed, maybe we'll start with you. I think it would be good to kick off with an explanation of what greenwashing actually is and why it does matter.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. I mean, I think there are lots of different strands to greenwashing. And as you say, this has come about, I would say, in the last 5 years, particularly as a term, but it's been around a lot longer, as I said earlier, as sustainability has become more mainstream, which is an amazing thing. But I think as it has become more mainstream, that it has led to a lot of miscommunication, sometimes purposefully, sometimes by accident, whereby brands, companies, organizations communicate part of their impact or a specific lens looking at parts of their environmental impact to mask and redirect their audiences and stakeholders' attention from actually some of the parts of their business that aren't being environmentally sustainable. And yeah, it's definitely a phenomenon that's come about across all sectors. There are definitely some sectors that are where it is a lot more prevalent. And I think one of the things that we often talk about is when it comes down to it, and brand communications around impact is communicating with authenticity. And I think that's fundamentally the piece that is missing when it comes to greenwashing is authenticity about the environment impact you're having, both positive and negative. So hopefully that gives a bit of a definition. I don't know if Karen, you have anything to add on that one?
No, I think we're good, Ed.
But I think then, yeah, maybe just to build on that, thanks, Ed. I think that was a really good explanation. But I guess, Karen, it would be really good to get your perspective on how much of an issue you think greenwash actually is, and maybe you could give us some examples that you've seen recently.
Yeah, I think it's a massive issue, in my opinion. I pretty much witness it every day in various marketing. But I think the tide is turning. I think consumers and businesses, customers are starting to see through it. So companies really do, who do greenwash, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, really do need to change. I think examples I've seen, fobbing off customers with carbon neutral claims through offsetting, I think, is one of the biggest things that that bugs me. There was an airline a couple of years ago that put out sit back and relax, we'll offset your flights. It kind of makes the customer feel like they're saving the planet by flying. That airline has subsequently corrected their greenwashing adverts and explaining that it is an interim solution. I think we'll probably come back to offsetting a little bit later. I mean, offsetting does have a place, but it only in conjunction with actual real emissions reductions. And companies need to make it clear what stage they're on in that journey. Another thing is clothing labels. Elements of this garment is sustainably sourced. How many elements? It could be just a couple of things. It could be 1%, and it really, and then the rest is unsustainable. Or it could be made in a sweatshop, or there could be lots of different elements about it that isn't sustainable, and it's really bad. I bought a regatta jacket a month or so ago, and it said on the label, in fact, I've still got it here, made from recycled bottles. Now, I fell for it a little bit because I bought it, obviously. But I actually ended up having to tweet them in the end. I looked up on their website. I looked at all the product labels. I got my magnifying glass out. Couldn't find anything about the percentage of the plastic bottles. Found out via a tweet in the end that it was 45%.
Right.
So it's less than half, which is better than not. But I've highlighted.
Let's say that, right? Yeah.
They really need to say it doesn't take much to put 45% on that label. Also, things that are green, coloured green, and contain like natural scenes of trees and leaves, and portraying a message that it makes it look like that company is completely green, and when they're not. And things that use the phrase eco. And those fake symbols that aren't sort of like accreditation symbols. And I know that a lot of companies are trying to be better and communicate things that they are doing that's really good. But I think some things they should, especially the bigger organizations, should just be getting on and doing it. One example, there's a big fast food giant out there promoting using biofuels on their for their trucks. The general population see their trucks plastered with that. They think, that's saying that we use vegetable oils from our fryers to power this truck. Sounds great in principle. And then they think, well, God, my burger's guilt-free today. But biofuels, actually, a lot of people don't know this, but they emit almost the same CO2 as fossil fuels. It's only the beginning of their journey that's more sustainable. What comes out of that tailpipe is almost as bad. So it's kind of like a slightly better bad solution that really that company should be just doing it without promoting it's like a good thing. And I think, I mean, those sorts of examples really show the complexity of some of these things, right? And I think sometimes condensing something down to this sort of pithy message, which just says we're now using this, which, to the layman's amongst us might think great, but actually it's far more complicated than that. And it is a very complex issue, right? Yeah. I mean, building on those examples that, I mean, you mentioned that, actually some industries are more guilty than others. And I think also, what we tend to see is that there are some companies out there that are downright lying, but also, and again, you alluded to this earlier, there's a lot of smaller brands out there, they might be trying to do the right thing. In their cases, I think they may not have the resources or the time necessarily to sort of, completely understand it.
is it fair that they get called out in the same way? You know, obviously with some industries, are they more guilty than others? I'd love to get your take on that.
I don't think so. I think you can't really compare, and I'm afraid I'm going to name somebody because they've been in a big documentary recently. The likes of ExxonMobil, who spent 40 years covering up, paying off scientists to say climate change wasn't affected by fossil fuels. You can't compare them to a small organisation that might have been running 30 years. That don't have the resources to be able to, manage their and measure, because measuring costs money. You know, you've got to invest to be more sustainable. We all know that being sustainable is, in the short term, more costly. But I think the solution.
Sorry, Karen.
Go on. I think the solution for that is that bigger companies in those same sectors need to share their learnings, make it open source, so the smaller companies can follow easier. Getting to net zero is going to take a lot of collaboration, and we can no longer wait while companies protect themselves from competition, because by 2040 there will be no competition because there won't be any industry.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, Ed, it'd be great to get your perspective on this as well. And I guess, you know, something that I'm always conscious of is, you know, obviously it's really important that any company that is being misleading gets called out, right? That's not up for debate. But is there a risk then that, you know, other brands, smaller brands, may be driven actually to inaction because they're worried about getting it wrong, because actually they do get called out in the same way?
Yeah, and that's why, like, just right at the start, I just wanted to really like distinguish that there are brands, there are companies that purposefully greenwash, and there are companies that make mistakes, that don't have necessarily the expertise when it comes to environmental sustainability because they're a startup, and that's a significant investment. So I think, building on what Karen was saying, it's about telling the full story. I think what some companies who have become very sophisticated at this, and particularly in like the oil and gas industries, like they have become very sophisticated at telling a very small part of their environmental story, but plastering that and labeling that as the only story. And I think equally, I think none of us want to sort of fearmonger, like particularly startups and new brands, about talking about their sustainability and their environmental impact. A lot of companies have been specifically set up as an environmentally or as an environmentally sustainable alternative to unsustainable alternatives, and it's important to differentiate, because that's how those brands are going to grow in their marketplaces. Because as you said, Nikki, consumers are looking more and more closely at that. I think what is really important is about telling that full story about. I don't think we should be I don't think we should be batting away organizations and companies that are somewhere along that journey, and everyone will be at different stages on their environmental journey. I think Karen's absolutely right. There's bigger companies that have been around for decades that do have the infrastructure and the resources to be able to effectively measure and monitor their environmental impact. Absolutely hold them to account, and also, like, we need to hold ourselves to account as businesses. So us as a social impact communications agency, Shape History, we're not all the way there. We're not a carbon negative company yet. We're on a journey, and I think this feeds into a wider piece around, and the best brands out there who have got sustainability and purpose more broadly at the forefront of their not just branding but culture as a business, are the ones who really honestly and authentically engage and talk with their customers, with their consumers, about the journey they're on. And that, as Karen said, like, the more we can do as a private sector, or actually as any sector, to talk about both the successes and how they've been achieved, but also talk about the challenges and what hasn't worked. What you'll often see in ESG or impact reports or annual reports at the end of the year is all the successes. These are all the things we achieved. Very rarely the companies say, these are all the things that we didn't achieve. But actually, I think that is probably like one of the most basic forms of greenwashing. It's not telling the full story. And I think there's a real fear that from a lot of brands that we speak to, that if you put out and talk about those the failures or the challenges, that's going to somehow have a detrimental impact on your brand perception. And for some companies it might do. And there's a whole piece around like investors and shareholder action and what shareholders really are really interested in. And I guess that has thrown up a huge debate around whether ESG is failing, and actually it ultimately comes down to what shareholders and boards really value in their companies, and whether that reflected in the way the brand communicates. So the last thing I think any of us want to do is dissuade people from talking about their environmental impact. I think that would be one definite kind of key thing if I was to suggest one for brands to take away. Talk about the successes, share those, but talk about the challenges, and talk about what you haven't done yet. No one's expecting every company overnight to be perfect, particularly companies who, in this kind of in the economy we're currently in, it's incredibly tough. Like this is one of the toughest spaces and toughest times for businesses since 2008, 2009. So to be trying to put more limitations on companies, I don't think is around kind of building their brand, and marketing effectively is not the right way to go. I think it's about doing that with authenticity, and being true to everyone has their brand values that sit on their wall. It's being true to those. And I think unfortunately, either on purpose or by mistake, not enough companies are doing that. There are some brilliant companies that are really living and breathing those those commitments to environmental impact. And I think all that those need to do is just tell more of the story. Like consumers, customers want to feel part of the journey you're on to some degree. And humans are not perfect. Like society is not perfect. We're on a journey. And I think being clear about what that roadmap, that your environmental sustainable roadmap looks like, what those goals are, making those goals really tangible and measurable, and not saying that they're goals that you're going to reach in 2050, but actually think about what all the steps back from that. For me, those are some of the biggest things that brands and companies can be doing, like talking authentically, setting really clear milestones, and reporting on both successes but also challenges.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. It is very much a journey, right? And I think just being able to sort of say, look, this is where we've come from, this is what we're looking to do, this is what we're putting in place to measure that, and how we're going to be reporting back on that. It is absolutely critical. And I think maybe we'll come back. Ed, you mentioned some examples of companies that are doing it well, and I think it'd be really good to come back to that actually a bit later, just to give some ideas to everybody that's listening. Actually, I mean, what is interesting, I think we've sort of talked about some of the things that companies should be doing, but I mean, again, Ed, you and I have had this conversation actually, and Karen, you and I, in terms of overuse of certain words sometimes. And, this is definitely something us marketers can be guilty of sometimes anyway, more broadly, let alone in the sustainability space. But is there a risk of that happening in sustainability? I mean, Karen, you mentioned eco, are there other sort of terms that sort of so overused that then it sort of negates their value, or actually just terms that companies should be avoiding altogether?
Yeah, there's one that's sorry, I was so eager. There's one that really bugs me a bit, because I hear it with so many large organizations, and you see it as the first line on their sustainability policies on their websites, and that is, we are committed to. Unless it's followed up by evidence or action, please don't use start a sentence with "we are committed to." You kind of read it everywhere now, and in senior leaders' speeches as well. Instead, tell us what you've already done. Start your sentence with, "We have reduced our real-time emissions by X," giving a baseline, and then you can say we are committed to reaching X by X. Don't start with "we are committed to," because it just sounds like greenwash. There's a whole big area around ocean plastics as well. Using virgin plastics is not, rather than not using virgin plastics, is a great thing. But this new label of sort of ocean-bound plastics is very misleading. On
yeah, and I think,
there is a label.
on this. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Go on. There's a label. There's actually a label for it, and they give an estimate that it's abandoned waste found within 50 kilometres from shores where there is little or no waste management in place. So basically, there is no guarantee that that plastic will end up in the sea. And quite what often happens is because marketing departments are trying to get a message in as fewer words as possible to make it really bold. They're dropping words, they're dropping in, important information, and that often gets changed to ocean plastics. So people think it's plastics that has been taken out of the ocean.
Absolutely. And I think it comes back again to what you were talking about before, is in, a water bottle or something like this may get sort of marketed as, it's made from ocean plastic, but actually, and it may be 5% or something like this, but again, it's about actually being really specific. And actually with any of these terms, it's about measuring it, right? It's about providing the evidence that actually something has been collected in a certain place in a certain way, and actually that's sort of fully tracked and audited.
Yeah,
for sure. Ed, are there any words from your perspective that you think actually companies should avoid? I mean, we've talked before even about the word sustainable, actually, because it's sort of bandied around so much these days, right?
I think there's probably like a whole kind of like urban dictionary of words that you shouldn't that become overused now, that we'd be here forever going through them. And yet, like, almost at the heart of it at the heart of all of those is sustainability. Now, I think sustainability is a brilliant word. Like, we should be using that, but using it in the right way. Also, let's not forget, sustainability goes beyond environmental impacts. You've got to look at social and the governance, the way that companies run. Sustainability has become very much associated with environmental impact, but there's so much more to being a truly sustainable company. There's so much more to that, and I don't think that companies should stop using that word, or any of the words we've already discussed, if used in the right way, are absolutely fine. But I think the problem is that the words we tend to use, I guess it's just asking the question of ourselves, is that word, that term, that phrase, that sentence truly reflective of our environment, of the environmental journey, the environmental impact our service or a product has gone on? If it's not, and we're getting loads of comments here, which is great. And one person asked, is like, how far do you need to go with this? Well, a QR code is the easiest thing to put on a product. And if you want to tell the full story of a product, a QR code in seconds can have a consumer on your website reading and really understanding the story. Absolutely, but particularly for products, there are limitations with packaging and how much you can put on your packaging, and definitely telling as much of that story as possible, being authentic. But also, if there's more depth to it, that like every brand should be thinking about, how do you get your consumers onto your website to spend more time learning about you as a company, learning about your values, but also ultimately potentially about purchasing and buying products and services. Use that as an opportunity to tell the full story, and again, not just what you're doing really well, but what are the challenges. There was another comment about no public company is going to list their environmental failings in their annual report, which may well be true, and there's a whole piece, as I mentioned, about looking around what's the true direction of your board, of your shareholders, and how does that filter down. I think failings, I did say that earlier, and it's probably the wrong word to use. Like, it's challenges, it's learnings, it's things that you're going to take, it's things you're going to take forward in the years to come that you've identified you haven't got there yet. You may, and any company who says, and it's not just across your environmental impact, every company, particularly in kind of the times ahead, are going to face challenges. It's how we learn from those, how we take those forwards, and how we act upon those. And that comes back to Karen's point, like avoiding commitments and really talking about actions and also milestones, and then not being afraid to hold yourselves accountable to how you've received those milestones. You wouldn't do it if you were financially reporting to your board and you'd had a really great year in one part of your business, but but a really challenging year in the others. Like that fundamentally affects your financial sustainability. So you don't only report on the really good stuff.
On the good bits. No, absolutely.
You report on the challenges as well, because that has a fundamental impact on how your company moves forward in the year to come. So why should it be any different for your environmental impact?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually something that you talked about there as well, in terms of actually trying to get the consumers to the websites, get so they can actually find out a bit more information about it. Certainly something that a challenge that I've come across for some brands is that quite often, the sustainability team within any organization, if they're big enough to have a sustainability team, will own these types of projects, right? It's within their team and their mandate. But actually, it might be down to the marketing team, the social media team, to actually communicate about it, and they may not actually have all the information and actually even really understand exactly what we're talking about today, right?
This has been a passion of mine for years, that you've got to engage your marketing and sustainability departments together if you're working on some kind of advertising campaign or any kind of PR marketing. But you mustn't let your marketing and PR departments lead that content. That content must be driven by data, and it must be driven by your sustainability team and done together.
I go even further than that. I actually think that your ESG, your sustainability, should thread through your entire business, across all operations. Because again, sustainability isn't just about environmental impact. It should cover everything, every part about a part of your business, particularly if you're a brand or a company that positions themselves as purpose-led. If you are truly purpose-led, then your ESG report should be your full annual report. There should be ESG quotas and criteria, and part of like personal development plans across every part of the business, because like every aspect of the business in some way will have an environmental, a social, and a governance influence. So yes, absolutely, PR, marketing, communications are where that tends to break down in the worst cases, and when PR marketing lead that. But there's so much more that can be done to train up PR, marketing, communications teams about sustainability, even at a basic level. Like, how many companies offer ESG training to all members of staff to understand what are we even talking about when we say environmental sustainability and supply and value chains? Like, people may have gone and done communications at A level, GCSE, at degree level, and never touched sustainability in terms of like really understanding it. I think that's changing now, and there are actually some brilliant degrees that are looking at sustainability and how that and the link with communications. But there are some incredibly talented people in really senior sustainability roles in the best companies. We recently had a chief sustainability officer of one of the biggest homeware brands in the world come in, and they've been on a real journey, and again she was very upfront about they've not got everything right. They've done a huge amount, and they're probably one of the leaders globally. But one of the things I took away from that conversation was that sustainability isn't a piece of the business over here, or ESG isn't a piece of the business over here. And I think, like previously to ESG, that was very much the criticism of CSR, was that it just sort of sat over here as like an extra thing we did. Like, ESG should really be filtered through every department. And again, that is challenging for businesses who are sort of starting up. But then it's thinking about what are the really easy steps that you can take, and how do you approach that with intent and with integrity and with authenticity.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that makes complete sense. And I guess so one thing that I'm quite curious about before we sort of dig in a little bit more into the sort of do's and what people should be doing is, if a brand does get called out for greenwashing, so the marketing team has put out a short pithy post and it doesn't have the context, and you get called out, how should they manage their response? What should they be doing with their communications to manage that and move forward from that?
I think they just need to put their hands up and say, sorry, we made a mistake. We were napping, and go about putting it right. I And I've got, if I can sort of use an example here of something, I've got a lot of respect for Iceland Foods, a lot of respect, and for Richard Walker. They are doing some amazing things out there. But in 2018, they dropped the ball. They made a massive mistake. Something obviously went wrong with their marketing and sustainability departments together. They declared that they were going to remove palm oil from all of their own brand products, which is something along the lines of 1,700. By the end of the year, they'd removed palm oil from all but 17 of their own brand products, which is an amazing achievement, incredible achievement. But instead, they removed their logo from the remaining 17 own brand products on their shelves. Obviously, there's a separate argument about whether sustainable palm oil is actually better than no palm oil. But yeah, it was an amazing achievement, yet they completely killed themselves, really, because they could have been celebrating it, where instead everybody on the planet was picking it up and going, oh my God, they've taken their logo off their products. So
and I think, as you say, obviously Iceland Foods are definitely sort of, up there in terms of they're working really hard to do things right. And it does just go to show that even if you are striving to do everything, the best you can, mistakes can happen, right? I think, like you say, the key thing is putting your hands up, acknowledging it, and then moving forward, right?
Yeah, the worst thing that you can do is ignore it. Well, actually, maybe not the worst thing, because the worst thing to do would be to deny it. I mean, but that would also be communication suicide. You just wouldn't want to do that. But ignore, like, a lot of brands, not a lot, but some brands just won't necessarily engage with those comments, because they've met their community management sort of their community management guidelines might say negative comments don't engage. But actually, having a conversation, like being real with people, and 100%, as Karen said, like hold your hands up, be honest. Like, we all, again, comes back to, we are all ultimately humans. Like, there is room for human error in anything that relies that involves people making decisions. We don't make it right at the time. I've already apologized 3 times internally for mistakes I made this morning. So, like, we are only human. Like, we make mistakes. And I think where people get, both employees and consumers get frustrated, is when it's just so apparent that people are, when companies and brands are trying to misdirect you. They're trying to be like, don't ignore that, but what about this? And like that again, it and I keep banging on about this word, but like, it comes back to authentically communicating with your audiences. Like, in the same way that if you get called out by a parent when you've done something wrong, like, if you just said sorry, or just held your hands up, you can move on so much. You can move on from that conversation, and you can start having a more positive one. As soon as you get defensive and start to put barriers up, which may come across as over, or as just as misdirective, that's when you get into trouble. But 100% don't ignore those people. And and actually, it might be the case that what you said is fair, is true, and that person has misinterpreted it. So use the opportunity to talk that person through how that's happened, and actually learn from it. Because if one person has misinterpreted a piece of marketing or communications you put out there, the likelihood are that others have. And it's not, and greenwashing can happen by accident. Not every form of greenwashing has a purpose, but it has intent behind it. So, and equally, so when someone perceives that you're greenwashing, they may not have the full picture. But again, it comes back to then tell people the full story. Like, use that opportunity to start that conversation, and whether it's in the media or on social media or through stakeholder engagement, don't shy away from those conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I'd love to hear from both of you. We've got sort of about 10 minutes left of us discussing, and then we will be opening to questions. So do put them in the chat if anybody has any. But in terms of, really, let's sort of focus the last 10 minutes or so on what brands should be doing. Ed, we'll start with you, and then I'll go to Karen with the same question. But you mentioned some examples of companies that are doing this really well. who are the standout ones for you in terms of who's doing a really good job in this space of being transparent and authentic?
I mean, there are some big and obvious names out there, like Patagonia as an example of a company that really does. You really do feel that Patagonia lives and breathes. It lives and breathes social impact, and that's always been a standout. But there are some amazing, really small micro companies that are sort of like 2-3 man bands who are telling their story authentically, and I think from what they're doing is one, they're telling the full story. They're talking about what they're doing really well, but they're doing about what they haven't got to yet, the challenges that they're facing. But they're also putting in milestones that they are then holding themselves to account. So saying, in the next 12 months, the next 24 months, the next 5 years, this is what we plan to do. This is how we plan to resolve those challenges, and this is the roadmap to get there. So that first piece about talking authentically, the second piece about setting really clear milestones, third piece about talk about your challenges as well as your successes. And I think also one of our strategists, Amalika, wrote a fantastic piece, not necessarily in this context, but in a different context, about centering the voices of the people that your products, your services aims to influence. There's a real also issue, and there's no surprise, sadly, that the three of us are all white on this LinkedIn Live. There's a real race issue in environmental sustainability. There are not enough opportunities. Yet there are some incredible people of color who are doing amazing work in sustainability. But those stories need to be told to inspire others, and to create opportunities. And unfortunately, there aren't enough opportunities for communities of color and other marginalized communities to be real leaders in sustainability, to not be real leaders because they are real leaders, but to be able to tell their story. So as much as possible, use the people or work with the people who are actually on the front line of your environmental impact to tell your story. That you don't have to do it through your brand channels. Use your brand ambassadors, and they may not just be direct employees of your company. They may be your suppliers within your supply chain. They could be that there's a whole stakeholder network that sits beyond just a direct employee. Give those individuals the opportunity to tell their story within your ESG or your sustainability or impact reports. And again, as long as that's done authentically and done with integrity, and it's not using those people to tell a story that is fundamentally a mistruth or only part of the story, as long as you're not doing that for me, those for me are some of the kind of the key things that brands and companies can do to more effectively and more honestly communicate their environmental impact.
Yeah, really good points, Ed. And actually, there's a comment in the chat actually from Joel, our CEO, who was saying, actually, funny enough, if you look at the Patagonia website, they don't actually use the word sustainability once. They tell their story of their challenges, their milestones, their successes. And, that really does speak to exactly the process that we've been discussing today. Karen, same question to you, really. I mean, are there companies and approaches out there that sort of stand out to you in terms of what companies should be doing?
I hadn't really thought about what companies specifically, but I suppose...
or just approaches, even like the key
I
things.
think I'm just going to mention one name, and that's Toast Ale. They were only started up probably, I don't know, 5 years ago, and they've been born with the aim to be completely transparent, completely sustainable. They have admitted when they've made little faults, but they predominantly they are on a journey where it's just perfectly intertwined with everything environmental and social. And they basically brew beer from waste bread, and their whole journey has just been perfectly encapsulated, perfectly done, and also perfectly communicated, I think, from my point of view. But are we going to do sort of some other do's and what we
yes,
what we should be doing?
Yeah, I think that'll be super helpful for everybody on the call.
Yeah, so I think I'm just going to go through them quite quickly because I actually wrote a list. I think tree planting needs to be looked at. I think you need to take, if you are tree planting, you need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. I think we're going to come to that briefly in a minute. Stop promoting offsetting as a good thing, but make it clear it's an interim solution. People are more aware now of what CO2 is and what CO2 means, even in the general public. And I think announcing the real-time carbon emission reductions with a baseline is, and show what it looks like is important. Be honest about your traceability as well. I mean, you could have an eco product that might be made of bamboo, but where was it made? Who made it? How did it get here? There is an entire journey behind a product or a service that, you can't just promote the actual tangible or non-tangible thing and then not tell the story about the entire journey. And also, I think just not about the written word either. Senior leaders need to be genuine when they have speaking opportunities and not just deliver lip service. If they're not telling the whole truth, they are effectively a sitting duck for your organization and completely exposed. And sometimes that does lead to unnecessary resignations. I don't have any examples. I'm just suggesting that, there's a lot of communication out there that CEOs will communicate, and it is covering up the truth. That's a bit of a passion of mine as well. So should I go on to tree planting, or should we come back to
maybe we'll come back to that shortly. I did just want to, I'm curious actually, just on with both of you in terms of, Ed, we'll start with Ed, but Karen, a similar question to you shortly after is, actually, how do you decide to work with a company? So at Shape History, if a company comes to you, like, how do you check like that they're being authentic, right? And their commitment is real?
Yeah, it's an ongoing conversation, Nikki, let's put it that way. Now, we've, like, in the past, we've almost exclusively worked with philanthropic organizations, NGOs, 501c3s in the US. And in the last couple of years, we basically looked at our vision as a company and sort of looked at that statement at the beginning of creating a fairer world faster. And the reality is that can't be achieved without all sectors, third sector, public sector, and private sector working towards that future and any part of that 2030 agenda. So we've started to work with brands and companies that have really got social impact either at their core or that they recognize it's not there yet and they need to go on a journey. So in terms of, sorry, Nikki, can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, I mean, basically, I guess it's how you decide to work with a company, how you ensure that they are being authentic, their commitment is real, is genuine, right?
Yeah, so it's, as I said, it's slightly easier, although not completely foolproof when it comes to philanthropic organizations. But there's a few things we do. We initially do an assessment of companies who want to work with us because our integrity is everything to us. We look at whether they are a company that is solely focused on social impact and then try to go into that and do a due diligence, or whether, as I said, they're a company that's looking to improve, that recognizes that they're not doing enough, or they're not even, and they might be doing great things in certain areas but not others, and look at how they can move it forward. And then if there is contention and there is indecision within the initial team that's been approached, we'll have a company-wide consultation. And right. there are a few companies I know that do this, and it's not to say we need to have 100%, but we certainly need to have a significant majority of people who feel comfortable with us as an organization, as an agency, working with that company or that brand. And it is a case of looking through impact reports, looking through ESG reports, talking to the people who are the decision makers. I think that's a big piece is when we're having conversations with ESG managers or sustainability directors, it's how far does this go up the ladder? How much commitment is there from the ultimate decision makers? And often those are people not just as CEOs, but also chief financial officers or financial directors. How much commitment is there to deliver on your strategy as an ESG or sustainability team? It's never foolproof, and there is a big grey area. Like, we've tried to put very clear parameters on it, And the reality is that this space is moving so quickly that there are new factors to consider all the time. And so it's a fluid model we have, but so far it seems to be working for us.
That's great. And like you say, it is so fast moving, isn't it? I think it's just a continuous conversation, really, isn't it? Yeah. And Karen, same question to you, really. I mean, for the Global Good Awards, how do you go about choosing the winners and actually assessing the claims being made that actually they are substantiated, right?
Well, we ask for evidence in our application forms, and I don't get involved. I have 40 judges that have got all experience in all different sectors and industries. I match that experience of each judge with the category most relevant to them, so they can see straight through any greenwashing. And we have 3 judges for each category, and there's 2 stages as online scoring without seeing each other's scores, and then they come together in person to bash out scores, argue over any discrepancies, and then they do some research if needed. But 40% of the scores of most of our categories is all based on action and actual evidence of impact. There's a lot of awards out there that are rewarding for aims and targets. We don't do that. It's 40% based on action. Right. And from a supplier point of view, if I'm trying to find a supplier, I ask them the questions if they're not on the websites. If they can't answer them with data, I either walk away if I think they should know better, or I help them on their journey to do better.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Right, we are coming up close to time, so I think just to wrap up the sort of what brands should be doing. I mean, some of the notes I've taken sort of from the conversation really are, you know, the top tips for brands are: be authentic, be transparent, and back up your claims with evidence. Marketing people, talk to your sustainability people that, you know, actually this needs to be embedded throughout the organization, your sustainability programs. Obviously, it's quite important that brands are not marketing actions as a silver bullet, right? There isn't a silver bullet. It's very much a journey, and it's really important to be open about where you've come from, what you're doing, where you're going, and to take people on that journey with you. Is there anything else sort of key messages to finish on before we go to questions from each of you that you would add to that list?
I think just a very simple statement: you have to measure your impacts. You can't reduce what you don't measure.
Yeah. I also, just to extend that, you have to measure all your impact, not just the stuff you know you're going to perform well on. And if you can do that internally, great. But if not, then bring in external support. And if you're a company that is just getting started, just be really clear about what you're making claims about, and making sure you've got evidence to back it up. Like it's again, it does come back to that really simple point, Nikki, of telling the full story. It's not. It's actually, as much as I don't do myself out of a job, it's actually not rocket science. But it's amazing how many companies choose not to do it, and there are, and unfortunately, ultimately, that often comes down to perception of, from an investment and a commercial perspective, and actually commercial and environmental, and actually all sustainability should work in tandem. They shouldn't be clashing. If they're clashing, there's something fundamentally wrong with your business model, and that will only become more and more prevalent in the decades to come.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's a good and strong point to finish on from the main discussion. Just looking into the questions, we've got a couple on tree planting, actually, Karen. So the floor is yours to discuss that in a bit more detail. What are some of the pitfalls for brands in terms of doing the right thing there?
So firstly, I think whenever I see the word plant tree for every order, it's kind of becoming the greenwash of offsetting. And many companies that are doing it genuinely don't even know that they could be having a greater impact elsewhere. It's kind of become the cool go-to for marketing departments. And I'm not saying that all schemes aren't good. We desperately need trees, right? But many don't have the structure or the funding after the planting is to protect what they've done. Plus the types of trees, the planting is important, the location, the hardiness. But the biggest issue with tree planting schemes is to offset is time, and funnily enough, sustainability. As an example, if you take a flight today and your airline offsets that flight. By the time the physical money gets through the system and a tree is planted, you can add another 10, 15 years for it to start absorbing carbon. If it survives floods, droughts, wildfires, disease, and then, of course, the deforestation, because a lot of these schemes are only guaranteed for 30 years. There are certifications to look out for if you are going to do that. I don't know what they are all in the different countries, but there's VCS, Gold Standard, Plan Veto, and in the UK, you've got the Queen's Canopy. But what's the answer? I'm trying to rattle through this, by the way, quickly. Tree protection. Cool Earth are an amazing company doing a lot of carbon capture and focusing on carbon sinks. Peat protection, sea kelp, plankton, whales. Whales absorb more carbon than trees do. And even concrete. CO2 is used to cure cement. So it creates a long-term storage. So get some advice and decide on what's the best for you, but don't just automatically go for, let's plant a tree for everything we sell. So yeah, that's in a nutshell.
Nikki, can I just build on that? Because actually,
yes,
with my comms hat on, there's actually a real opportunity there for companies to act. Because Karen's right, there are so many companies that for every purchase or for every % profit will plant X number of trees. But it's if nothing else, it's unoriginal. Everyone's doing it. So as Karen said, there are not only other alternatives, there are actually better, potentially more cost-effective alternatives. There's a real opportunity for brands to actually do something different and communicate something different. And from a USP perspective, if you're in a competitive market, if you've got 4 other kind of competing companies who are all saying we're going to plant a tree, talk about something different. You're going to stand out if nothing else. And actually, you're going to probably end up being more effective as an environmentally sustainable company and more interesting as a brand to engage with as a consumer.
Yeah, that's good advice there for sure. And just looking at the questions here, so we've got another one for both of you, I guess, which is, what are the top 3 KPIs you measure in your work with brands?
Ed, you go.
That's a difficult one.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks, Karen. Cheers. I mean, I guess there are a couple of ways that you can look at that. There aren't. I wouldn't say there are 3 single top KPIs that we measure, because we do so much different work with different brands. So I'm going to slightly redirect that question to the general approach we take to all of our work, which is outcome focused. I think there are too many agencies that focus purely on output, being like, we're going to do this, this, and this, and this, and our approach is, well, what's the change we want to see? And more often than not, it's what's the human impact do we want to see? And I think one of the challenges with work in sustainability and environmental communications is that there are very few areas of work where you can see you get instant quick wins. It takes time, and it takes often investment and resource to effectively monitor and evaluate. And companies more often than not don't have enough time, even in their strategy, to be able to either invest or to measure over longitudinal periods of time. So we always, across every project, take an outcomes focused approach, and then wherever possible, it absolutely is breaking those down into key measurable metrics that where companies and brands can hold us to account in the short, mid, and long term. Karen, how was that?
Karen, yeah.
Looking at the time and looking at the other couple of questions, I'm not even going to add anything to that. I'm a single person business. I had to even look up, I know what KPI means, but I just had to look up the exact definition. I'm not even going to add anything to it.
That's completely fair enough, Karen. So maybe we'll pass this question on to you that's just come in, which was, if you were handing out awards for
yes, I know,
that was got your name all over it. Who would win and why?
Interestingly, I am in the process of working on, and this is the first time I've mentioned it publicly, we're working on a kind of like a leaderboard idea called Tough to Transform. It's not going to be an award. It's going to be looking at the brands that are in industry sectors. And if you're familiar with B Corp, it's pretty much all of those definitions at the beginning of when you have to declare if you're in any of those sectors. And we're looking to create like a leaderboard of tough to transform companies and industries that are making good impact. Because, right, you know, look at these big, massive companies. If they're reducing their carbon emissions by 5% in a year, that's quite big. So we want to not reward them, but recognize them and allow them to have a platform without allowing them to greenwash. So it won't be an actual award. But if you wanted me to go for industry, oil, tobacco and arms, I'm not going to say any company names, but you could probably list them all.
Yeah, that sounds like a great initiative, Karen, for sure. I just looking through, I think that's all of the questions that have come in. So I think that's a really good place to finish. Thank you very, very much, Karen and Ed, for a really lively discussion, and to everybody listening. I hope that was helpful, and, you know, do feel free to reach out to any of us if you do have any more questions. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Nikki.
Thanks, Nikki.